Welcome back. We're on Module 5, Lecture number 2, which really gets into the stress systems, and probably will also discuss a little bit of kind of the daily living with stress and some key ideas there. So I'm calling this the psychophysiology of stress, again, to kind of emphasize this interconnectivity, the interconnection, mind-body, right? It's been a common theme of 329 throughout the time you've had this course. But there's two basic stress systems, which I ended with in Lecture 1. SAM, or sympathetic adrenomedullary activation, and that's kind of the fight or flight. You also have to keep in mind there's the parasympathetic modulation as well. So there's the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and they kind of are a yin and yang type of systems. And then there's the HPA axis, there's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. Again, you can see how there's this connection between the nervous, the endocrine, immune functioning. So these two systems are related to stress, and you can see how the body's stress systems and the SAM, the sympathetic, I have in blue, and the HPA axis I have in red. Again, this may be more confusing than it's helpful, but the idea is, again, that with the red, for example, or with the blue, the SAM, right, you have this through the hypothalamus and really gets into the adrenal medulla, and ultimately releases things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, which again, these are all stress hormones and ultimately connect to the immune system functioning. So again, that's the basics of really what you need to know here. All right, so you got SAM and you got HPA axis. The HPA axis is probably more involved in terms of the stress immune functioning than is SAM over a long period of time. Relates to the adrenal cortex, which then relates to the release of glucocorticoids and cortisol. Again, make sure when you watch that documentary on stress kills, focusing on Dr. Sapolsky, he discusses this at length, and so you should get a good idea after you watch that video in terms of some of the basic stress response. So you've got SAM, which releases the epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you've got the HPA axis, which releases the glucocorticoids or the cortisol. Again, hormones, for example, certainly here under HPA axis, which then we know suppress immune functioning or make our immune system go a little haywire over time. And depending on your genetics and the environment in which you're in, can lead to all kinds of conditions, illness, autoimmune conditions, and so forth. So that's just kind of the basics of these two stress systems. Stress engages both SAM and HPA axis. Again, SAM releases catecholamines, and HPA axis releases cortisol, reduces the number of white blood cells. So you can see how there's that strong connection between our stress systems and immune functioning. Now, the long-term effects of this chronic stress response, again, as I've been hinting at, is not good. So you got to be careful about how you respond to stress. Body is reacting in a way that doesn't really help. So you have this chronic discharge of epinephrine, norepinephrine, catecholamines, glucocorticoids. You have these high levels of these hormones running around your system when you don't really need them, and as we know, that leads to immunosuppression. It can even lead to destruction of neurons. It can lead to depression. Yuck, yuck, yuck. You can see how from one figure with stressors, the system similar to what we were looking at with those stress systems, right? You've got these stressors. If they're interpreted as stress, you now get into things like anxiety and depression, and especially in this chronic phase here, right? Chronic phase here, you have that HPA axis activation, corticosteroid release, leads to immunosuppression, decreased number of lymphocytes, decreased lymphocyte and NK function, and you have an accelerated disease progression. So this system right here on the right, going from stressors all the way through to accelerated disease progression, is one that we can try to avoid, but you won't if you continually interpret stressors as stress, especially if you've got genetic predisposition, as I did, obviously, with Sjogren's. Some people have predisposition for MS, and other types of cancer, and so forth. So just kind of an example of these stressors and how it leads to ultimately disease progression through the immune functioning. There's also information data out there, and you'll see this in the video on stress kills for personal connection paper number 5. Chronic HPA activation can result in storage of fat. Now, exercise in general seems to activate sympathetic but not HPA, which is why exercise in general can be protective of our health in terms of enhancing that immune functioning. And you can see from the simple figure, similar to the stressors, right, that aerobic exercise training, right, can help reduce that stress and anxiety. And again, we're still trying to figure out how that works exactly, but there does seem to be that relationship. Once you have that, of course, through regular exercise, you get this decreased anxiety and depression, which then decreases catecholamine release and helps you kind of have normal or immune normalization, normal immune functioning by increasing number of lymphocytes, by increasing NK function and decelerated disease progression. So exercise, you could probably substitute meditation up here as well in terms of having somewhat a similar effect, although exercise seems to be some kind of unique experience which leads to this process. So you can see how just something simple as exercise can help reduce that link between stressors and decreased immune functioning. Lots of examples of the stress immune system connection. I'm not going to go through all of the examples. You can go find study after study after study. Many of them are in reading, I believe reading number 10. Academic stress seems to lower NK cells, for example, which is why you may get sick around peak times like final exam period. Negative emotions are linked to NK cell, so on and so forth. So lots of toxic kinds of links between stress and an immune system, which then leads to disease and other kinds of conditions. Now, you can adapt to chronic mild stress, but moderate to severe stress over time leads to health problems of all kinds. So this chronic, moderate to severe stress is really the key factor. And again, stress is likely to be determined by this person, by environment, fit, or interaction. So lots of complexity there. I tried to kind of make it as simple as I can. Some of you may even have had more introduction to this. I've self-taught myself over the years, mainly because I teach this, but also because from my personal experience with autoimmune, I've tried to understand a little bit more of how stress works. I tend to not cope very well with stress, especially daily realities, daily hassles, traffic jams, relatives being sick, kids creating havoc in your life at times. So I've had to learn to really try to figure out that what do I do about it? And the key element here, and we're getting into now this third section, daily realities of stress and coping and health, is your resources and the situation are crucial. And ultimately, and I don't want to make this all kind of, it's just psychological, but it's ultimately how you do appraise the event or appraise the experience, perceive the experience. Do you perceive an event as harmful and threatening, or do you perceive and appraise an event as challenging and something you want to approach? It's really ultimately that appraisal process that kicks off that stress response. So stress results from the process of appraising events as harmful, threatening, or challenging, of assessing potential responses, and of responding to those events. So there's big things that happen in life, there's daily hassles, there's some interesting research which I'll show you here in a second from Penn State researchers which have looked at this long-term kind of daily hassles of, we all have our own brand of these daily hassles, but the stress research by Penn State researchers has been interesting. Just came out about a year ago. Reactions to everyday stressors predict future health. So this isn't something that you just can kind of push off to the side. It's how you react, how you appraise these experiences which lead to good health or poor health. So what they did is they followed people along for like 10 years or so, and they did saliva draws to get at releases of hormones such as cortisol. And they did this over a long period of time, 10 years, 1995 to 2005. So they've got this longitudinal data. They were able to look at change in daily experiences over this time. What they found was that the people who become upset by daily stressors and continue to dwell on them after they have passed, much more likely to suffer from chronic health problems, especially pain, such as that related to arthritis and cardiovascular issues. This is, 10 years later. So they kind of, and again, maybe not so much black and white, but they kind of break people up into two types. You have the Velcro people, and you have the Teflon people, and you can kind of get these images in your mind. With the Velcro people, they kind of hang on to these stressors or stress. They get very upset. By the end of the day, they can be grumpy, so on and so forth. Teflon people, stressors happen to them, they slide right off. For example, in last night's basketball game, my son seems to have some kind of knee injury, could be an MCL tear. How do you handle that, right? Not only how does your son handle that, but how do I as a parent handle that? Right now, I'm probably not handling it very well. Just seems like another thing happening. So how do in my brain do I reinterpret this experience, right? My wife just had shoulder surgery. My dad has multiple myeloma. Every person has these issues in their life. How do you appraise these as just, oh, these are just part of life? Or do you kind of internalize them as stress? And I tend to definitely over the years have internalized these things as stress. I'm probably more of a Velcro person. You can kind of decide what you are, whether you're Velcro or Teflon. But some very cool research by Penn State researchers who have studied and followed people over a period of 10 years to show that these daily hassles are serious. Some people interpret them as stress. Some people interpret them as, what the heck, it's just life. So how are you going to interpret that? Also, this relates to clients you'll be working with, right? In terms of how do they handle their physical therapy, or how do they handle chronic illness? How do they handle their physical therapy? So some interesting things. So there's two types of appraisal. This appraisal is really the key word in all of this. There's primary appraisal and there's secondary appraisal. Primary is you kind of get at the stressor level and you say, no big deal. Secondary is how do you cope? So maybe once something has been identified as definitely something as a stressor that has a potential for stress, how do you cope with that stress that you experience? So there's primary and secondary appraisal. And again, not to get into all the detail on stress consequences, as I talked about just with the Penn State research, there's lots of consequences, but stress is a very significant issue in our lives. Over 50% of the deaths in the U.S. are attributed to stress. Anxiety, America's #1 mental health problem. Stress can cause absenteeism, burnout, mental health. There's something now in worksite health promotion called presenteeism, where you're at work, but you're so stressed out, you're not really doing anything, so you're not very productive. $300 billion. This is serious stuff. Not to, again, create this gloom and doom, but stress is linked to health in all kinds of ways. And what I tried to show in these first two lectures was that it relates to the immune system, and then it relates to how we cope with that stress, either through primary or secondary appraisal, that ultimately leads to, are we going to experience this chronic stress over time, which then leads to immunosuppression, or are we going to be able to cope with this stress in positive ways, such as through physical activity or eating right, or stress management or meditation that helps us once we do experience stress, how we cope with it. So I'm going to stop here, and when I come back, we'll get into the third lecture. I'm hoping maybe the last one of KNH 329 through Module 5. I'll talk a little bit about the seriousness of some of the specifics of stress, and then we'll get into flourishing as a way to maybe exacerbate or ameliorate that stress.